There you go. So go back. It's become a shorthand for a lot of things. Corporate culture. You know, culture wars. We're the last 40 years have been a really a cascade of culture wars between different social groups globally, really, and it really intensified in the 90s with globalization. Consumer culture, especially in America, we're socialized a lot to buy with consumerism and consumer capitalism. I mean, if you look at consumer spending, it accounts for almost 2/3 of economic activity, right? And there's very few, and we'll get into this with media socialization, and this relates to this is there's this race for your eyeballs, right? To keep you clicking, right, and what you see. And there's a really good article on the known and unknown that if you guys want to reference that, it's in the stuff on culture. So there's it's a shorthand for a lot of things, and as you guys know, well, essentially sociologically, we're looking at values, beliefs, attitudes, customs, bills, behaviors, and all those material objects, and those things that get passed down from parents to child, from different social groups throughout time. Um, in languages and things like that, those customs allow culture to exist. We'll unpack a lot of this stuff. It could be very simply too. One of those shorthands they use for culture is, youth culture, right? That's always changing. Very distinct values, attitudes, beliefs. And it also includes things like worldviews and ideologies, and how we look at things, which we'll get into in a second with ideology and how that works. Those physical, tangible things that we see. One that we all could relate to is food. This kind of mixing of global cultures with food, as well as music. You see a hybrid of global cultures now. Most of us here in the Fort Wayne area can have, especially, there's a diversity of groups, especially with the impact of the Burmese community in Fort Wayne, due to, things with globalization, with food, and different ethnic enclaves, things like that. And then when culture gets tricky, please at any point, and when we have Zoom meetups, stop me if you need me to explain anything, or, slow down. Um, so when culture gets tricky, right, and we've seen this with the culture wars, the kind of in-group, out-group dynamic going on between different groups, and the result of globalization, and the growing, shifting racial ethnic mix in America. We look at beliefs, values, and assumptions about the world and worldviews, right? And this is where it gets tricky. This is where cultures clash, okay? And one thing about social groups, do tend to not like a lot of change, right? We want to belong to a group, right? And when some of the sociological terms is for cultural lag, to catch up to this change. And there's been rapid cultural social change in the Americas, especially going back to the 60s. In which we'll get into in a little bit. But this has always been going on. This is nothing new, is it? Right? And really where these ideas came into being, is with the age of exploration, and colonialism and things like that, and the relationship to other groups. But this is, this exchange between global cultures, hasn't always been enmeshed in a culture war. There's always, always point to something that happened in Muslim Spain, right? In the Moors in Spain from the 7th century to the 14th century. You had, universities and centers of learning that sprouted up, the ideas of libraries in Moorish Spain. And there was a lot of people from Greece, they had Slavic social groups from Northern Europe that they used as slaves, but there wasn't a slavery as we know it. It was a slavery where they actually, educated, the Slavic slaves. They treated them good, they fed them good. And there was this really cohesive type of thing going on. Of course, they had their own, problems, but you had Christian, Jews, and Muslims all, exchanging ideas about this thing with faith, interfaith type of stuff, and really kind of a diversity of viewpoints and things, and exchange of knowledge, right? And that really spurred the Enlightenment movement. A lot of scholars will point to that. And so you see this today. If you turn on a lot of the junk media and stuff like that, you see a lot of the culture wars and things like that. So sometimes we'll refer to this as non-material or symbolic culture. I don't know if I talked about as well. I'll get into that later. So this is a very important part, is how ideologies work, right? Perception of the world, worldviews. Now, ideology is this kind of, I'll give you a definition here, this external, like integrated systems of ideas that we assign value to things and that we believe in, and it influences our perception of the world. It's used by dominant groups, especially the elites, right? In societies, it always has been. You go back for a long time. What we're seeing now is just kind of a remix of how ideology works in the 21st century. It's a blueprint for social engineering, isn't it? It gets people to go along, even though it may be, right, false, right, or kind of a pseudo type of ideology. People, want to believe that they need meaning with culture and non-material culture. They need a sense of belonging, right? They one thing that we do, all groups do this, is we want to belong to a social group, don't we? Even if that, and this kind of starts at an early age. This gets into some of the theories of socialization, belonging. So you see a lot of the social movements today, a lot of it, even though, some of it can be misguided, right? But people have a deep sense of belonging, even if the perception and the ideologies that are put forth are very hollow, thin, type of assumptions and arguments about the world. People need something to believe. They want to believe in a group. So this goes, if you go from society to society, the China, Cuba, in the West, and whatever. This is how it works, and it's very, very useful, isn't it, for people in power to use this, right? Both sides of the political, divide do this, right? They pitch different, and a lot of it today is nicely packaged up, really simple interpretations of social reality, isn't it? Right? Because one thing they know, and as nation states and empires built with how global culture spread, they realize if you could get people to believe things, they'll be able to perceive things this way. And we'll get into this with ethnocentrism and in-group, out-group dynamics in a second. Emotions, right? This is very important about culture. Emotions assign value to things, right? And they undermine reasoning, right? So, if you put reason on top of an ideology, it makes no sense, right? When you look at truth and social facts and things like that. But it becomes what I talked about last week with subjective reality, right? Subjective interpretation, right? And one thing that's important about sociology, we try and get beyond, what you believe or what your opinions or how you feel about something. We're more interested in disseminating, the version, like Weber said, trying to understand things and relate to, and take all this stuff apart, right, and put reason, right, on top of these things. So this is nothing new, as you guys know. We're in very, very locked into ideological battles in, right, America, aren't we? And a lot of this is pushed through media apparatuses and things like that, Facebook and things like that. So, I mean, it's not a new thing, but it creates, culture clash, and creates, problems, needless to say. But this is important. Um, so when you look at values, like I said, this is important, especially with norms, and behavior. Language is an important component of that. I don't know if anybody here has lived abroad, or has gone abroad, or has been grown up in another country. But one thing cognitively, that culture, and being exposed to difference, right? Different mindsets, different ways of life, different languages. It, the research shows that does amazing things, especially for young people's minds, but it also does it to adults, right? When you remove yourself from everything that is normal and you immerse yourself in another society or culture, and you can even do it here, can't you? um, and this idea, that the world is this dangerous place, whatsoever. It's the research on this shows as well. It's not. A lot of people, want to exchange ideas and sit down and share their culture, share their way of life, and things like that. But what it does, when you're able to remove yourself, and do good sociology, and put yourself, in the framework of another culture or society, it does a lot, especially with language. Language is nothing more. We assign names for different languages, but it sociologically and linguistically, it's just a system of symbols that's strung together in an infinite amount of ways. There's a linguist at Harvard, Steven Pinker, and then there's a linguist at Columbia, John McWhorter. You can see their TED Talks where they talk about language. We assign Spanish, French, Swahili, English to them, but it's just really just symbols, isn't it? Right? And how we look at this. But language, and those symbolic representation of language allows culture, right, to exist. It can be used, right, when we go back to ideologies. George Orwell said, language, um, language perverts thoughts, thoughts pervert language, right? How words are used throughout time. And of course, Orwell in 1984, an Animal Farm, wrote about that in his books, with the complexity, of social life back then, post in World War II, World War One, World War II, in that time. So that's very, very important to with words and how those use. Language perverts thoughts, thoughts perverts language, and it goes back and forth. And if you notice that, people in positions of power, when they promote ideology and perceptions of the world, it almost, even to today, it's almost like it's in a very elementary form of language, isn't it? It's almost like third or fourth grade type of interpretation of the world, and it's nicely packaged, because that's generally what we find out with people in social groups. They want just a very prepackaged interpretation of the world, right? But what do we know sociologically about that, right? It doesn't necessarily work that it isn't this nicely needed package. But what they know, and this goes back to the growth of nation states, post-enlightenment thinkers, is that if you can work with emotions on people, people will assign value to those things, right? And they're not motivated by reason, right? It's more by emotions, right? And if you could get to that emotional aspect of people, philosophers call it emotivism, that you don't have a lot of rational discourse going on with global cultures, do you? A lot of it is kind of irrational, right? Franz Kafka, great scholar, said, and a literature figure said, the irrational has become the rational. We'll look at this in the socialization process. Max Weber warned about this. C. Wright Mills, Du Bois, were concerned with this. So they assign value to things, and this is where social norms come into being. Those expectations, are kind of rules of behavior that develop out of a particular social group's values. You guys have any questions on any of this? Going right at you this morning at 9:30. Morning students are hardcore, I say. That's my theory on morning students that take morning classes. You're ready to grapple with this intellectual inquiry and this stimulating quest for knowledge that you guys are all on. And we could go on and on about norms, social norms. It's the glue that holds societies together, right? Manners, etiquette, all those type of things. Character and uh, working with people in different groups. When you do that, especially with language, and you expose kids to difference, it does all types of cognitive things, and even adults. And we, all of us in here, know we need a lot of that these days, right? Because we live in these, back to ideology, we live in these ideological echo chambers, right? And we're getting whatever our news and our information on the world, usually it's really prepackaged with these type of things. So when you look at values and value contradictions, there's things here. Something that we look at sociologically is look at the contradictions of culture. And Daniel Bell, a sociologist, wrote a book in the 70s called The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism and American Values. You see things like, democracy, inequality, and freedom. And at the same time, sociologists have documented a lot of racism and group superiority with social groups and how that works. Some of that is lessened, some of that has gone up through recent. And then you look how this stuff kind of evolved with the founding of this country. Different lecture, different chapter. Something we'll look at later. Now, this is, with subcultures, those are cultures that operate, within a given dominant culture. But, things like, youth culture and different ethnocultural groups that work. Not all, societies do that, but generally you find this with, subcultures and how that works, kind of a remix of the dominant culture and living within that. A lot of groups, social groups, live in ethnic enclaves, right? You see that in a lot of societies. And that can be a good thing, right? With people, but also it can be a bad thing. With different social groups. Now, this is something I want you guys to read your essays and write on. And when we get to the halfway point, when you write on these essays, you can look at your notes and compare, and through your own, worldviews and own personal beliefs and ideologies, disseminate this type of stuff that's going on. When you've heard some of these terms before, ethnocentrism and xenophobia, ethnocentrism tends to flourish when there's a lot of economic anxiety in a society. Okay, you could go to any society and you'll see this, right? And it creates a lot of real and perceived perceptions of the other. And usually it's immigrant groups and people, ethnic cultural groups that get scapegoated and blamed. It happens a lot with the populist movements of the last 15 and 20 years globally. Um, so when you see economic downturn, economic anxiety amongst middle and working class people, you see a direct correlation with ethnocentrism. You saw this after 9/11. You saw this, recently with xenophobia. One thing that's happened in American society, especially with middle America, with the middle and working class, a lot of those social groups, their lives have gotten worse and worse and worse. The jobs are gone, right? Um, and the de-skilling of jobs and the change has shifted. Democrats and Republicans alike have been on board for really the wholesale dismantling of the manufacturer base in America. And this is, we'll leave the rabbit hole of the big debate on this, is whether it's good or bad. But what we know, we do have a body of research evidence to show, you see this with, and it's a correlation to things with addictions and the opioids and the drug addictions, and problems in family, problems in school, and a real alienation. So when some of that stuff I wrote on the discussion board, and we talked about that with Emil Durkheim. It's a correlation to this with suicide rates too. When the social structure stops, right, working for different social groups, people react in very irrational ways, right? They're looking for meaning of why, right? And very something that relation to power. We'll talk about this with C. Wright Mills's theory on power and culture. How power works is you create an outside enemy, right? If you remember when I talked about the growth of sociology with the University of Chicago School at the turn of the century, you had Blacks moving from the South, you had Eastern Europeans coming, Jews, Catholics, Irish, Poles, Italians, Greeks. All these people were scapegoated. Xenophobia was probably at was more intense back then than it is now. Politicians, use this, right, to get in this, and there was real economic anxiety. There was levels of social inequality, especially economically, that were affecting these groups, right? And this is where really a design for social ghettos came to being at this time, right? They placed these people, they were subjugated just the way the Blacks were coming from the South. They were designated to certain parts of the city. My family are Polish immigrants. They lived in certain areas, kept them away from the dominant white group, right? Redlined these areas. And that basically was a design for the ghetto, right? And you create that, this is the oldest trick in the book, right? Those people are the problem, right? And it's usually the poor and the immigrants and the subordinate groups and the groups that are traditionally socially marginalized. So, we really stress cultural relativity, right? And trying to understand culture in its own terms. So if you look at society like this in relation to this is all stuff you can write and explore on. There's plenty of information on this. So think of this society as this, like that, right? And you have these statuses, right? And these are assigned, and these grow, out of historical and cultural representation. You have ethno-national groups, that's the dominant group. You have ethnocultural groups, you have ethno-linguistic groups, you have ethno-religious groups. And then when groups are, scapegoated and treated as inferior, and it could be based on skin color, like Blacks have been, or the Jews, or it could be religious, like the Catholics, for a long time, or the Italians or the Greeks or the Irish, right? They get racialized, right? Or what happened after 9/11, right? And usually this comes from people in positions of power, or mass media has a big play in this too. You know, you look at the Middle Eastern community; they're very prosperous immigrant group for a long time, very highly educated, um, very integrated into American society, really good. Um, you know, the Chinese as well. You know, when they created the Chinese Exclusion Act, you know, after the Chinese built the railroads, right? They threw them under the bus. You know, they did the same thing with Mexicans, right? After the Brasil program, where they had this guest worker program where they brought over 500,000 Mexicans from Mexico. Once they ended that, you know, these groups were stuck here. They didn't really offer them a path to citizenship. And then by 1970, when they opened up the borders again, right after the 1924 um, Immigration Act that pretty much closed the borders when you had this surge of Eastern Europeans coming. And this is where that term ethnic comes in. Uh, So, you know, they in the 70s, you had a very anti-Mexican backlash in Latino as well, of all Latino groups. You had a huge growing racial ethnic mix in the 70s and the 80s, on to today. And there was a backlash amongst certain ethno-national, especially within the white community, groups that were uncomfortable with this, right? And a lot of this sociologists look at is it coincided with globalizations and jobs leaving, right? Economically, it got very hard for especially groups within the white community, across communities as well, not just whites, where the jobs were gone. You know, they couldn't provide. And so right along, you know, you get these ideologies that come along. And it was ripe for xenophobia. You know, so if you look at any different society, you know, the Chinese are doing it with the Uyghurs, the Muslim minority in China. You know, you see this in Burma as well. And you know what this has happened globally, right? If we put this lens globally and look at ethnocentrism and stuff like this, this is the ramifications of all this. This is socially dislocated about the United Nations and Amnesty International estimated around 100 million people now are dispersed, you know, because of these things. They have they're stateless people, right? They have nowhere to go. They're in holding pattern. And then on top of that, you have a pandemic, you see. So now it's very easy to create, right, and to seize on this xenophobia. You know, when you have economic anxiety, you know, when you have tens of millions of people jobless now, it's very easy for people in power, especially politicians, to seize on this, right? So you find this in Brazil, you find this in European nations. And it's always the most convenient one is, you know, the newly arrived, the immigrant groups that come, right? So, you know, so if you look at this, you know, and it's this type of what we call othering. You know, some of the things in this class I'll go into are a little more advanced things, but I want you guys to get your money's worth. Makes sense how that works.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
and you know, so I mean, outside of um, these are social constructions, right? There isn't difference. And when we see difference, but what we find through the Human Genome Project is 99% of human DNA is the same, right? What we ascribe to difference is socially constructed, right? So this is something important. This will be on your midterm essay, but also we'll come back to this, you know, some of the things I highlighted with immigration historically with the Chinese and the Mexicans and the Eastern Europeans and Blacks migrating from the South, and stuff going on today. We'll come back and revisit and go into a little bit more when we get into race and ethnicity, okay? Questions on this? You know, and you know, economists, um, economists and sociologists, have for a long time, um, research demonstrates across the board, um, that immigration is good. You need it, right? It's good for the economy. It's good for communities, right? It's good for kids, to be exposed to different groups. Um, it's not good to live in, I use this term, the ghettoization of society, right? In the social, cultural, racial, and religious, ghettoization, this, these kind of tribes, if you will. And you see this. And you find with America, what has happened, going back to the 70s, we're more segregated than we have ever been before, because of this stuff. And as you guys know, you didn't need to walk into the sociology class to have me tell you that. So now mass media, you throw this on top of all that, right? And narratives, of the pictures that people paint, right, within these stories that are told through mass media is very concentrated now. Okay. 6 major corporations own all mass media, about 92% of it, not all, but close to all of it, right? As far as digital, you've got, you know, Facebook, uh, Google, Twitter, and most people are getting their information and their news about the world, about what's going on, from these major corporations. Of course, there's alternative media and stuff, but not a lot of people do the work to you know take a piece of information and break it down and sit down with an objective fact checking news organization and sit down. People just don't have the time anymore, right? They're working more. People are working more and more and more and more, and have been saddled with more responsibility, especially with the pandemic. But the problem with what sociologists will call media imperialism, and this is also true in its expansion throughout the world, it creates a very narrow view of what is exactly going on in the world, doesn't it? Right. And so people live in these ideological, and this creates groupthink, which we'll talk about next week. They live in these little echo chambers, right? And they go right to either, say if you look at 24-hour cable news, CNN, MSNBC, or Fox News, and they're just spinning basically the same story, put forth through whether the liberal Democratic Party or the conservative Republican Party, or if someone sits down and is able to have the time to listen to, say, a national public radio, all things considered, throughout the morning, and hear a whole bunch of different viewpoints on a particular study, a particular news story, right? And present it this way, like NPR does, you make up your mind, right? Take how you already see the world, take up what these scholars and academics and these foreign correspondents that are dispersed throughout the world reporting on this stuff, and you decide. Or say they have the time to sit down with the PBS NewsHour for an hour where they do the same thing. What is, looking at different sides of a particular issue, right? And just that we're living very hectic, rushed lives. I know lockdowns are on, but for middle class and working people, our lives have gotten harder. We're working more hours. We're out in the pandemic. There's a lot of job loss, and that's going to continue. I mean, each week about 900,000 jobs, have gone, the permanent job loss. And this is really kind of the beginning of this. So people are stuck in these the same thing. So, but it's very useful to put people in power. You see this type of analysis because they just paint the same package up, kind of a pre-package. We'll talk about George Richard's series, McDonaldization. So what it does is it creates kind of a hegemony, right? Noam Chomsky, a famous scholar, a linguist, looks a lot at thought control in culture and democracy. He's had one of the highest positions at MIT for like, I mean, he's like 90 now. He wrote a book called Manufacturing Consent um, in the late 80s. And he looked at this concentration of news media and information reporting and how it's, how they pick, they report on this very narrow view of the world, especially with the dominant news media. And it creates a consent, right? It creates more um, uh, the elites and the dominant group of people in power are able to, especially because of economics, wedge their way within these media organizations and get their ways. So you have a different type of spinning just to get people to go along. All societies and cultures do this. So hegemony that's another advanced term with, let me get this out of here. And this was put forth by a scholar by the name of Antonio Gramsci. He was put in prison during World War II by Mussolini, right? He was a sociologist. And he said it's much easier for the ruling class to create what he coined the term hegemony. That the dominant group would be able to control information and ideas within a culture, right? And what Noam Chomsky said, manufacture consent to get people to go along. Before media apparatuses and propaganda back then during Gramsci, it was Nazi propaganda, fascist propaganda. Instead of brute force. So Gramsci wrote a lot. His book Prison Notebooks is literally written in the prison. He had to get his research and writings out to his family members. But this is really important. If you can control the stories and the information and ideas, right, through media apparatuses, then it's very easy to rule and dominate within a culture, isn't it? So very, very totalitarian governments do this. Democratic societies do this as well. And there's very few, media outlets that control all this. So, I mean, you see the correlation here. So this can create, further advanced marginalization and in-group, out-group dynamics, with the given culture. So those relate to ethnocentrism and xenophobia, the irrational fear of immigrants and others, people other than your social group. It can be real and it can be perceived. A lot of it is perceived, right? Because like I said, it's economists and sociologists, for a long time have documented this, the research. Immigration is good, you need it, right? It's good for jobs, it's good for competition. This idea that there's these swarms of people from different countries after your jobs, and if we just close the borders, wages will go up and life will get better for everybody, working class people. And that's just that's fiction. That doesn't how it works. So a lot of research to document on this stuff. Now we'll wrap up here with consumer culture. Questions on that hegemony? You can find a lot of information on that. So the ideology of consumerism, I talked about this, especially with children. $22 billion is spent on marketing each year just to kids to get you to buy. They want to keep you clicking, right? They get you on Twitter, they get you on Facebook, the pop-up ads. And this idea that this steady acquisition of consumer products, happiness can be achieved. Well, studies find that's not really what happens, right? That it creates a lot of debt, it creates, a lot of problems with people. That there's only a certain level. I think that one study showed that out of the University of Michigan, I think $70 or $70,000 a year is like the top of what people make. Where happiness is like, you know, a copacetic level of happiness. Anything after that doesn't create any more happiness, right? Basic, life possessions or anything more than that kind of creates a rational thing. So this is another aspect of culture, consumer culture, and there's an ideology of consumerism. Google, they got you right. Once you start, Timothy Wu, the thing. He's a scholar that talked about this, the curse of bigness. There's very few companies, Google, Facebook, Apple, and all these things that's the race for your eyeballs, right? They want to keep you clicking. He calls it the casino effect, right? You go on. Say Jordan and Jess and Jason, I'm seeing your names here, and you check your email, right? You check out some stuff on Canvas for our class, and then something pops up, and you start clicking, or you see a news thing, and you click on it, and then you realize 3 hours have gone by, right? And you're like, oh, what the hell just happened to me?
Yeah.
I just went to check my email. I just went to and I just bought something with money I don't have,
what I've been noticing a lot.
Amazon has just kind of plowed through, all that.
You know what I've been noticing a lot lately? About 2 weeks ago, I unplugged from all social media. Well, 90% of it. I'm no longer on Facebook. I'm no longer on Instagram. I never was on Twitter. But before that, my girlfriend and I have 2 dogs. So, and one's a puppy. He's very mischievous. So I Googled healthcare for my dogs, like insurance. And then all of a sudden, my news feed on Facebook, every other ad was health insurance for dogs. And I never even once looked at it on Facebook. It's just weird how it's all connected.
And I want to end on this book, but back in 1999, Barry Glassner wrote a book called The Culture of Fear: Why Americans Are Afraid of the Wrong Things. News, 24-hour news exploded, right? This created this really grossly exaggerated occurrence of news events and amplified them, through media repetition, right? And it created, a lot of it was, crisis or, fear type of stuff, fear, crime. They used to put, a good example I like to use is, this is FBI statistics, right? Kids don't get abducted, right? 99% of kids that get abducted are a parent that overstays their, with divorces, right? Overstays their visitation or something, right? Corporations seized on this, right? And it's to this day where, they started putting on the back of milk cartons, if some of them, of these kids, right? Call blah, 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 and we'll talk about this with deviance and social control. And, there was things with after 9/11, right? That this idea that there are these jihadi terrorists hiding behind every bush and, go out and buy guns and, put locks on your door. Well, it turns out that, that these were just your chances of getting, killed, by a Muslim terrorist after 9/11. You had more of a chance to fall in the bathtub, taking a shower and dying, right? Then, but they pumped this through news media. And then the same thing is with crime, right? It could be health scares too, right? One sociologist called this, people get addicted to crisis porn, right? So you look at a lot of the news media back then when Glassner looks at, and I would argue, and Glassner would too, that it's just worse now. It's crisis after crisis after crisis, bad story, fear type of things. And it keeps people doing what they want you to do. They want your eyeballs clicking on these stories, right? What they call it clickbait now, right? They want you glued to that TV set. They want those 24-hour. They got the thing going on at the bottom. You know, they got the story, the people that report on this. You know, the people on MSNBC and Fox News and CNN. They're like these wax figures. You know, they're like ridiculously, you know, cosmetically surgery, and they read teleprompters, right? And it's just this same story, kind of like recycled by. And what it does, it was very useful, especially for people in power. Glassner argues in his book, it creates this fear, right? This irrational perception of the world. And one thing Glassner found in his study was crime, even to this day, crime rates have been dropping and dropping and dropping and dropping, right? um, there's a problem with white on white homicide rates. There's a problem with black on black homicide and crimes and killings in certain areas of the country. You know, for blacks, I think it's about 8,000 a year homicides within black community. With whites, I think it's about 7,000. But these are isolated things. Crime rates have been in different, you know, areas of the country. They've been dropping. Reporting on it has gone up over like 600% on crime, right? So it creates people, they think they're living in a world that's a lot more dangerous than it actually is. It's very safe to go out, and this gets us into socialization, to let your kid get on his bike and go on his skateboard and ride around the neighborhood. But what happened, it kind of broke up communities, didn't it? Yeah, where you know, the research shows, demonstrates that, you know, you don't see a lot of, um, you know, kids, you know, just freely going wherever they want and things like that. They call it, you know, sometimes they call it safetyism amongst parents, you know, or Jonathan Haidt called coddling of the American mind. They coddle these kids, right? They hover over them, you know, their whole lives until they're 18. Then they get into college. We'll talk about this with socialization, and then they can't, you know, they can't think their way out of a box. Mommy and daddy aren't there. You see that a lot with upper class kids. Questions on any of this stuff with culture, and that's going to get us into the stuff on socialization. We'll take a short break. Can I explain anything further about the lecture on culture?
What was the name of that Noam Chomsky book you were talking of earlier?
Manufacturing Consent.
Because I have one, but it mostly just talks of Bertrand Russell lectures, and I would like to read up on what you just said. Manufacturing and Consent?
Manufacturing Consent, yeah.
All right, thank you.
Let me, I could put that slide back. Do you want to write it down? See it there? That's the name of the book.
Thank you.
They actually give you guys an option to there's a documentary called Requiem for the American Dream. And the second film analysis paper, I let you guys kind of choose. I like you to do it on American Factory, but there's a documentary you can watch for free. It's a conversation with him about his work, about, you know, his research and what's happening now in America and what's happening to especially middle and working class people. So heavy guy, but you know, he's someone where you know, you listen to and you feel like your brain expanding, right? He has that type of effect, like you're taking some type of hallucination or, you know, drug. I know, no, that's not bad. But you feel like you're kind of getting high on what he's saying, you know. So yeah, it's called a Requiem for an American Dream, and it's actually a good. If you write that down, it's a really good kind of sociological discussion with him. He explains a lot of things that I actually just kind of went over with. Amazon has it for free. YouTube has it for free. I think you just have to subject yourself to advertise commercials. Let's take a quick break. We'll come back in 5 minutes, 10:25. Sound good? All right, we'll get into socialization. All right. So, questions. I mean, Phil, I hope you guys feel comfortable, you know, with me in the class and the information and the flow of my lectures and things like that. Let me know if ever, if you have questions. If you feel more comfortable meeting me one-on-one at the Zoom meetup, let me know. I can arrange one outside a Zoom meetup outside of your class, outside of the class. Um, when I give you time to start working on these, like I said, each week, each lecture, there's certain things I want you guys to write on for your midterm essays. If you want to talk about that more, during the time I give you to, if you say, hey, shoot me an email, hey, can we have a Zoom meetup real quick, or say keep the room open. I might have a question when I'm working or whatever. Feel free to do that. So socialization, right? I can tell you guys are all productive members of society, right? You're going to college. I'm sure you guys probably have jobs. You're striving, right? That's the whole goal here, isn't it? To get people, educated, preferably, a college degree, that they have immersed themselves in a broad base of knowledge, different viewpoints, different perceptions of the world, different philosophies, and study research. Um, and then you're out there working, right? And you're paying taxes, and you maybe volunteer, you have a kid, and you're transferring that down to your kid, right? So this boils down a lot to the nature versus nurture debate. You guys have heard this before. And it's how the personality is formed, how much comes from nature or heredity, our genetic loading, and how much comes from nurture, that social environment. A lot of the sociology, isn't going to say it's either or, and I don't think any scouts here. There's some social biologists out there, kind of social Darwinists that say it's all genetics, but that's not. Those are very thinly veiled arguments, and usually they use those to um, for their own purposes. But it's a mix of there's a lot about genetic loading that we don't know. Okay, and there's been a lot of breakthroughs, but we for our intents and purpose of study, we're going to focus more on that wider social environment, its influence. um and when you work with this, and with socialization, there's some things that are just kind of like the core with kids. When kids are in a environment, learning is an ongoing process, right? People often say, college is really just to get you. It signifies to the labor market that you're willing to immerse yourself in learning. You're open-minded. You have a diversity of views. You're able to work with people. You're able to put a goal. You work towards a goal, and you're willing to learn. So if you go work at Sweetwater after you get a liberal arts degree, they're going to say, okay, this is great, right? You've been properly socialized. You're going to work with us. You're going to show up. Part of life is just showing up, right? For the job, or showing up for class. And it's a constant, process, dealing with teachers and parents and schools and college and mass media. College is a big learning curve, as you guys know. Um, so it's very important for young kids, and you see study after study after study. One is to, reading, right? To be exposed to books, to read at an early age, to read to get, but also constantly engaging in what we call Socratic dialogue, right? Speaking to them, building their vocabulary, right? Speaking to them, and why, learning new words, quite constant questioning, right? What does this mean? Well, that's why, and you exchange, right? You have this type of thing. Or with the pandemic, explaining, things to them. They see controversy. They see, this world. But when you have those conversations, And also, unstructured play, right? Not having the parent hover around them. One thing that's really good, people have this idea that schools are the only place where learning takes place, right? Education scholars will tell you that that's not true. That's a small part, right? And you need to do well within that, right? And get into college and all this stuff we're doing here. But real learning takes place in the real world where you don't have your parents. Jonathan Haidt's The Coddling of the American Mind is a good study. It's a book. And I have some of his videos out there. um, having, you don't hover over them and have their lives all planned out for them. Let them explore, let them go outside, let them ride their bike all over the place. Let them deal with boredom. One of the best things for a kid's mind is to deal with boredom. I don't know what to do, I'm bored. Good, that's great. You figure out what you're going to do. Okay, so now that kid's brain has to go, oh, okay, what I have this at my disposal. I have, I guess I'll use my son, how many action figures do you have? No, 20 action figures, so I have to recreate these Marvel scenes or whatever, right? Legos, having a, those things, those darn plastic things are expensive, I know, but the people that, design Legos, Miles, what's that game you played when you're little? Minecraft. Minecraft is another one. Um, you have these blocks, right? And you got to build things. Do not put them in school until they're 6 years old, if you can. Most societies, the societies that are doing really well, and they have very good, socialization processes, as far as, educational rankings, are the societies where they don't put kids in school. Take Finland, for example, in the European social democracy. They don't put kids into school until 7th grade, right? Unstructured play, right? Just being around a parent, to discussing things, right? Is way better than a schoolroom. Because what we find now is a big problem, especially with boys, right? Because their bodies are telling them to question, play, go, right? Interpret the world around them, and their bodies are being told to stop doing that, sit in the schoolroom. We're going to treat you like clerical workers for 12 years, right? Because essentially that's what most schooling does in America, doesn't it? You sit there and they dispense knowledge and they take little multiple choice tests. Well, scholars look at that stuff and that's crazy. That's one of the worst ways to educate you. Different lecture, different chapter, we'll come back to that. So, what happens is learning gets arrested. And we have a big problem with boys, and that translates in a problem with men. Young girls and women are doing just fine as far as mobility patterns in school. The men are, you don't see them do very well in higher ed. It's mostly women. And, there's a big academic debate about that goes back to like around 3rd and 6th grade, where you see learning arrested, right? And they hit this wall and you just see them drop off the cliff, especially with working class kids and minority kids. And kids develop perceptions of the world and they have to interpret that, right? And if you're coddling a kid, which we see with parenting styles in the last 30 years, it's created this big problem. And then what happened, if you have with Generation Z, they've all grown up with smartphones, and social media and Facebook and Twitter, right? So this is a new big area of sociological research, because we have, I guess, what we call in sociology a control group with Generation Z, especially the upper class kids. Now, the working class kids, right? The kids that didn't have their parents doing all that for them, the initial studies are saying they're doing quite well, right? Because they had to figure things out on themselves. Their parents were working. They might have had 2 or 3 jobs, right? They had to let themselves in for school. They had developed the discipline to do their homework, right? fix themselves something to eat. Their parents weren't around. They weren't rushing them around to violin practice and soccer practice and football and baseball, keeping them out on the sports field, until 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night, travel soccer and all this stuff. So that's a new area of research. So this is very important, and it also is with the problems. So when you look at language, and so this is very important. We call the socialization process. Once we do that, society makes us human, right? We become actively engaged, and we develop into adults, and that's the whole goal here. Um, so, if we look at, some of the social problems, we'll look at deviance and social control, while we have this problem with incarceration and things like that. A lot of the scholars that focus on socialization will look at this, and they'll go back to around third, fourth, fifth, sixth grade, where they see these, especially boys, drop off the mat, the expulsions. And then there's another problem with the over medicalization, right? How they're reacting to this is, they're giving these kids at a very early age, to settle them down and stop them, especially boys, Ritalin and things like that. There's a conversation with a psychiatrist, Fadi Hada. If you see at the bottom of the scroll down, you'll see sociological interviews. And they talk about that. So this is a new area of research. So, the psychological aspect, you guys can take a psychology class for this. But some of the stuff Freud and Carl Jung and cognitive development and this growth, that what happens with people is that we're not rational beings. A lot of our social psyche is irrational, and a lot of this has to do with the socialization process, and how we develop self-concept and how we see the world, right? And what sociologists look at, the looking glass self is one that we point to. And this came out of Du Bois's double consciousness theory, and Charles Cooley developed this. And what you have is, if you break the self down, the social self into, you say, the physical body, the intellectual self, right? And then that emotional self, the kind of that soul, that governs, that inside, right? The heart, feelings, and things like that, emotions, and drawing balance between those things. But one concern of social psychologists was that people, the emotions take and override everything, the physical body and the intellectual self, and draw irrational perception of the world and themselves. Okay, that we don't really evaluate things through rational analysis, and we don't analyze our own self-concept through that. How we do that is by how others see us, okay, and others' perceptions of us. So the looking glass self here, can you see this okay? We imagine and we perceive how others see us, right? And we interpret that, right? And then we come to conclusions about ourselves, and we evaluate ourselves based on how others see us, okay? And that gets developed into our self-concept. So what this research shows and what this theory shows is our perception of self really is skewed, isn't it? Right? And it creates kind of irrationality, where, kind of the irrational becomes the rational. And one thing about people, and even adults, this theory would argue, is we want to belong to a social group, right? And that sense of belonging, and we're willing to kind of broker and interpret, things in a way that's going to include us in this group, our way of thinking, our ideology, right, or what have you. Um, uh, and so it could be, then we start kind of breaking it down. Do they like me for being, smart or dull, or do they think I'm dumb, or what do they think of the new pair of shoes I'm wearing, or the new sweater, or the new, right, how my new haircut. Well, what we have found, right, especially you see this in America, people are very self-conscious, aren't they, about how others see them. And this kind of grows. There's all these variables of why that is. There isn't just one thing. But this starts usually at an early age, doesn't it? uh, and when kids get to be 17 and 18 years old, their ideas and their perceptions about themselves haven't been fully informed, right? You haven't really start to learn and study. This idea that high school is the great, the best time of your life. That's the biggest fiction. I would argue, and others. Really, real life comes, after high school. But what people do is they may latch on to kind of an identity group, right? We see this with young kids, especially today. Um, with some of the social justice stuff, or they may, go down the route of latching on to you know, deviant groups or what have you. Um, Kids try on different identities, right? They're very impressionable when they're younger. That's why it can be very dangerous, especially some of this far right and far left type of ideologies that are out there right now, where kids will go along with this. Um, and so I mean, this is a big problem right now. I mean, you see this with some, there's some concern with gender reassignment surgeries. There's a big growing trend amongst teens with this. Some sociologists and psychologists will point, to some of these classic theories of self and perceptions of self. And sadly, parents are going that where that's an example current with that some of the sociologists are looking at, and psychologists. Um, but adults do this too, don't they? Right? And some people can be very hollow selves, right? Where they're not at peace with themselves and they're trying to find something, right? It may be a clique group at Sky, that sense of belonging. um, Even though it may be irrational, right? And the perception of the world might be, but they're willing to go along with that. um, so this goes back a long time, decades and decades and decades, some of these theories. So it's this three-step process with the looking glass self. And now, with social media, is this, behemoth monster, if you will, that's doing this. So you see these kids clicking on Twitter and TikTok and things like that, and seeing what their friends are doing, and wanting to go down that rabbit hole with that type of stuff. And even adults do this. That's why a lot of things in popular culture, some of the social movements can be very attractive, on the far right and the far left, today. Even though a lot of the ways of going about that type of stuff can be very disastrous and destructive. Um, so I point to Jonathan Hyatt's research, um, and there's a lot of the videos on this. So now with socialization, mass media socialization is a big one with this now, isn't it? Especially with a lot of the Gen Z groups that have kids that have been grown up with smartphones, um, and this 24-hour news cycle, and the TikTok and things like that. So this is a new area, cutting edge research, and we're looking at this, and some of the initial findings are a little troubling, that the scholars are looking at. So the other one, one thing, and this is kind of an old classic definition of socialization. If someone's been socialized, is if they're able to learn to take the role of the other, right? To put them in, put themselves in someone else's shoes. George Herbert Mead talked about role taking, right? And looked at children at play, right? And what kids do when they play. Unstructured play is very good for kids, dealing with boredom, having to figure things out for themselves. And what kids do, they use their imagination, right? The brain grows, right? The only way kids' brains can grow, um, a lot of scholars will argue, is if you don't have the parent hovering over them, if you just kind of let them go and explore, use their imagination, play. And when kids play, we all did it, right? We might play Marvel superheroes, or we play house, right? Or we do with our parents, right? Some of you might have dressed up in your mother's clothes, right? Or your father's clothes, or let's play house, or let's play school, right? You be the teacher and you remember those things we played. So what that does is kids now are using their imaginations, and that sparks brain growth, cognitive growth. And then in having them exposed to difference, right? Multiculturalism, things like that, different social settings. So Mead, talks about that initially starts with the significant other, your parents and your siblings, then extends out to the generalized other, your friends and your peer groups. And it allows us, to modify our behavior and anticipate how people will react, by doing that. And how our perceptions of how people think about us and how we work and how we present ourselves, and, creating a robust socialization environment. Sadly, a lot of that has been arrested in a lot of kids, from the upper classes down to the lower classes in society. Now, mass media socialization, different sociologists place different emphasis on those. This question for the midterm essays on mass media socialization and its influence, that's really free for you guys to explore. When we get to that point, when we stop at deviance and social control, you'll hear me interject this thing with media. I know you guys are tired, probably of this, right? But it's a big, it's a big. I might be tired of hearing this, but you guys are free to explore that, and with the socialization process, and look at what some of the academics and scholars I put forth on there. So the agents of socialization are very important, and different scholars will put different emphasis. Some say the family is the most important, however you define it, right? Dad, son, my mom's son, mom, dad, whatever. When you have that nuclear family, right, the personality is able to grow, right? The brain is able to grow when you have people at home talking to you and, discussing things constantly questioning, right? Socratic reasoning, why is good, right? That's what you want. That's how brains grow for young kids. We'll look at this with education in the coming weeks. And parents get obsessed about where their kids go to school, and a lot of the research comes back to it. It's more what takes place in the home than what takes place in the school that show mobility patterns and education of how far kids go in college. Different lecture, different chapter. The school plays a part and the peer groups play a part. Some sociologists will emphasize that, especially when some kids get to the point where, your parents aren't as cool as they were, right? You go through that phase, then you get to be about 29 and 30 years old and you start realizing how cool your parents are. Then you get to be my age, 53 years old, and you're like, oh my God, I've become my dad, right? Yeah, so that emphasis, schooling is a big beehive and rabbit hole to go down because they're not doing the things that they're supposed to be doing, right? And the pandemic has forced them to reform. Colleges too. Half the students that start college don't finish, right? They come up when students get in jam with debt, it's because they don't finish, right? Then they have this mounting debt, very little. Here's another problem with schooling and education is very little goes to instruction, right? Very little goes to instruction. I'll say that again. A lot of the money goes to huge administrative staffs, right, to administer these places, right? It's a big problem, right? It's um, people say it under their breath, right, at these institutions. We know the research. You can just follow the money, right? Um, and so that's a problem, right? If most of this stuff, money that's spent on education in America, if they're, I mean, the high schools haven't reformed, the curriculum has been the same since the 1960s and 70s. It's still mass testing. Other societies have completely, the world around higher ed and education is changing, but especially K through 12 hasn't changed, right, to keep up with the world. Um, if we're spending all the tax money on just these behemoth administrative staffs, from then that's a problem, right? And we're seeing this decline with American students comparatively to other societies internationally and globally, that we're getting our clocks cleaned on the education front. So this is a big problem, and we'll kind of see, we're still kind of in survival mode with this pandemic, aren't we? When people emerge, what these institutions will do, because they're not doing, they've rearranged the bureaucratic boxes with school, but the results are pretty dismal. Um, some sociologists are going to say mass media, especially, your junk media, your 24-hour news media, American school kid. Then you have, all the screen time and the smartphones. These kids are getting smartphones earlier and earlier and earlier. The social media, I mean, it's pretty much across the board. We thought this was going to be really cool and a good thing, and we're turning it out. It's been disastrous. It's created a lot of polarization. It's not the source of all this, right? There's other variables in this, but they're not the they go on these apology tours, the Mark Zuckerberg and stuff, and the Twitter CEOs, and but it's that these places aren't, we're seeing, uh, not good for kids. We have a big problem with suicide rates among young people, because of this. 25, it's up astronomically. For boys it's 75%. For men it's up 75%. For girls since the 2000s it's up 25%. Those are big numbers, right? Especially with all that's happening in school. So then you throw all these things, and you throw some of the the polarization within the political um, arenas, and it's just it's a lot of decay. It's a lot of cultural decay, media, and it's almost like a race to the bottom, right? To with socialization, and it's so you're free to explore that. We'll come back to some of this stuff. I don't want to sound like some crotchety, academic scholar. Is this is bad. It's not all bad, right? Too much is not good, and we could go down a rabbit hole and all this type of stuff. But with these, especially when back to what we talked about with hegemony and manufacturing consent and corporate media ownership, it's creating these we'll talk about this with groupthink, this very narrow version and perceptions about how the world really works, right? One thing about socialization, and this is like, Jonathan Hyatt talks about this, one of the lies that they've taught kids, and this is especially true of my generation, um, is trust your feelings. What's your gut tell you, right? How do you feel about something? Well, it turns out, your emotions and your feelings usually are wrong about something, right? That you need to stop, talk back really to how you feel about something, right? Or how you feel about something, or the good thing that, good example is, whether it's a piece of information or, a consumer product thing or what have you. Um, and so it's a lot of this, how you feel, your feelings, but what you should do is really check that and get to strategic reasoning. And people don't do that. They want to understand the world, and by clicking real quick on social media, a very prepackaged um, interpretation of the world. We're starting to see this has caused, a big problem within American society as well as others. And so that's a theme we'll come back to, especially when we get into social stratification. We'll talk about that next week with groupthink. We'll talk about confirmation bias, and those type of things. But I talked about ideological echo chambers in these divisions. And it's a problem. So, questions on any of this? Makes sense? Is it useful? Questions? I'll let you guys, kind of break off and take, go over your notes. I mentioned a lot of people. You can go back and